This is Robert Clotworthy, and you are listening to Oak Island Plus, a discussion of Oak Island and other mysteries from around the world. Here are your hosts, James McQuiston, Oak Island theorist and author, along with John Hamels, PhD and historical researcher. Get the whole story right here, brought to you by Rabbit Hole Investigations.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Oak Island Plus, episode 10. I'm Doc Hamels, along with
Jim McQuiston. And we got an enjoyable show today, we hope. And I just want to mention that we have something like 18,400, 500 views so far. So we're just so excited. Every time Doc sends me the stats, they just keep climbing. That's what we want.
It's really incredible. And with that being said, I'd like to invite all of you that do watch our show, our channel, Oak Island Plus, to subscribe to our channel. And, you know, I was sort of new to this, Jim, but all you got to do is push the little subscribe button below us. I think it's over here somewhere. Yeah. And if we get to 1,000, that's our goal, right?
Right.
Get to 1,000 at least. And we're over halfway there. So all of you that have already subscribed, thank you so much. A lot of the heavy lifting is done, and we really appreciate your comments, and we take them to heart. And I know that Jim and I discuss them very often, and Jim gets back to you because he's the guy that knows the answers most of the time. So anyways, we do ask you to subscribe if you would. Also, if you're interested, we got a Facebook page, Oak Island Plus, and we try to put some fun little extra photos behind the scenes and some comments and announcements from time to time. So today we got a little different kind of a show, and Jim's got a surprise. I'm not gonna tell you what it is. He's got a special announcement today, but we want to remind you this: that Oak Island, the whole story of Oak Island, can't be discussed just in isolation. And I think that's been the theme that we've been trying to hit on.
Yes.
Back in the early 1500s, even before that somewhat, and into the 1600s, that was a huge time of exploration and colonization and angst going on in Europe. They were trying to come to Americas, and we've seen this all up and down the east coast of America. And during that time, there were many orders of monks, noblemen, knights, different orders of knights. I hadn't realized this till we worked together on this. And they all kind of worked in parallel. You know, they were in different countries and so on, so they might not even known what the others were doing. And very often they were working in secrecy because, Jim, I think you've described it many times, if you opened your mouth, you lost your head in those days. So that's why so many things are very secret. Some of these orders still exist, you know, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Some have faded away into history, and I've learned a lot about some of these organizations. And others have morphed into new orders or new organizations. The thing that surprised me lately is that each of the countries, for the most part in Europe anyways, the developed Europe, they had these organized groups, whether they were for colonization, for religious purposes, or the military and so forth. And once again, they're running in parallel and may not even know about the others. And then many times historians have their histories that they present, and they overlap. So something that was happening in 1620, there was something else going on in 1620 in another country. And so we've seen this over and over again, especially when you look at the history of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Cape Breton, Quebec, and as we have learned recently, Anticosti Island. The histories have just layered and overlapped with all of these organizations. So Jim now is going to tell you something really cool. So Jim, I'm going to leave you with that.
Okay. Well, kind of what you were describing was a multi-generational conspiracy of elites from different countries that cooperated with each other. And the big news, if you haven't already heard, is that last year when I wrote Oak Island, a Masonic Conspiracy with a lot of help from Doc, that was my 10th Oak Island book, and I swore off any more Oak Island books.
Done.
Mainly because I thought I've already fed them way more than they've ever used, and I don't want to continue to inundate them with, let's call it evidence, that's not being used or whatever. So I swore off Oak Island books. But I got this invitation to do a talk at a Masonic Research Lodge for 55 Masonic historians from 5 different states. So I spent months preparing for it because I wanted, I figured I got to be spot on there. So after that was over, and it was a wonderful success and all that, I had all of that sitting on my computer. And I thought, it's crazy to not share that with the world, and I don't have to put Oak Island in a book just to share it. So what I've come up with is a book called Perpetual Prohibition. And where that line comes from is that in 1312, the Pope outlawed the Knights Templar. And the words he actually used was perpetual prohibition, forever wearing the cross again, forever calling yourself a Knights Templar, any of that stuff. And I thought, wow, it's got a little alliteration to it, perpetual prohibition. And so what it does, and you'll see on this very first slide, it kind of demonstrates it. There, you can see my book there, and that gentleman standing there is supposed to be Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. Up in the right-hand corner, you have the Maltese cross. Now, it's taken a few forms through the years, but this is more or less the final one, and we've actually found evidence of Maltese crosses in the Nova Scotia area, which is going to be a later show. And then what everybody seems to avoid, except for us, is the Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia, which is that badge down at the bottom right that you see there. And from there, that played a role, let's put it that way, in the development of Freemasonry. It's not 100% responsible for it, but it definitely played a role. So that's what you're going to find in this book. It'll tell you, like chapter 1's about the Knights Templar, chapter 2's, chapter 3 actually is about the Knights of Malta, then it'll go to explaining what was going on in Scotland at that time, then it'll go to the Knights Baronet, and then it'll go to the Freemasons, and it'll show you the family links. If you look at that slide again real quick here, at the bottom I have family lines, ideals, and possessions, because it can be proven that the Freemasons had Templar possessions. They had at least 12 of them, which they wrote a little book about, and we know the family lines, which you're going to hear some about tonight. So the very next slide that you're going to see is a little bit wordy, but I'm old and I need some help remembering it all.
Jim, before you get to all this, where do you get all this information from? I mean, this is a lot of history here.
Yes. Well, the guts of the book were brought out of my earlier books and my presentation, but there were gaps that had to be filled. And the thing about it is, as we always talk, we go down rabbit holes. And we try to go down the deepest ones possible, which are actual documents from back in the 1600s. In this presentation, you're going to see a couple documents from 1312. That's how far back it is. But they're available either perhaps as a photo or a website about that, or you can actually find the scanned document, particularly books from like the 1600s. We've been in a bunch of them. There's the King's Privy Council minutes. There's personal letters that the King wrote to people like William Alexander, the proprietor of Nova Scotia. So we just keep drilling down through all those, looking for keywords and what fits the theory.
So the words that generally you and I don't use are perhaps or maybe.
Yeah.
We got the documentation,
yes,
primary sources.
And we try to, I think we always do say where that source is, not.
So somebody else could go back and find it, right?
Yeah, a lot of it, we're leaving it up to the viewer or the reader. If you have a question about something, go online and start looking for it, because you'll find it there, because we did. Google Books is one of the best areas, but also like Rutgers University and different
Electric Scotland,
yeah,
lots of great sites.
They will scan these things in for the public, and they're free to read them. You can read a gazillion letters by William Alexander to the King, to King Charles. King Charles wrote them back. They're all the original. They're sometimes they're hard to read because of the old
right.
English styling, and the spelling is Nothing like what we spell most of the words today. But anyway, so that's where the source of it comes from. So if we take a look at this next slide here, I'm going to try to go down through these pretty fast, but in 1312, as I mentioned, the Knights Templar were officially dissolved, and I'll show you that document in a minute, by the Pope, and their lands and possessions were given, for the most part, to the Hospitallers, which was another religious order that actually provided hospitalization for pilgrims. And they became, well, they started out as the Knights of St. John, and then eventually they became the Knights of Rhodes, and finally they became the Knights of Malta. And that's what we know them as, the Maltese Cross, the Maltese Falcon. All of that's from this group.
And this is where I was alluding to organizations morphing over time.
Yes.
And they're all connected.
And so they received the bulk of the possessions of the Knights Templar. And they weren't outlawed yet because they hadn't threatened any king. They were trying to be helpful. So things went on somewhat swimmingly. They had to move from the Holy Land. They moved to Rhodes, and then they moved to Malta, but they stayed together as an organization. So we jumped to 1540 in England. King Henry outlawed not only secret stonemason meetings, because he didn't want anybody meeting in secret and making plans against him, and he outlawed the Catholic Order of the Knights of Malta. Well, the last Grand Master of the Knights of Malta in England was named William Weston, and he was the second person to lead a fleet for the English, but he was the first Englishman, because John Cabot is the first to go to the mainland of America, up the Atlantic coast, but he was Venetian. He was sailing for England. William Weston was English, and he was sailing for England.
And we talked about him in our last show.
And he's a Knight of Malta, or the last Grand Master of the Knight of Malta in England, and he's going to Nova Scotia.
You know, just as a footnote, Jim, I was driving around Pennsylvania yesterday, and all of a sudden it dawned on me as I'm looking around, there was the Steelworkers Union Hall. There was the Electricians Union Hall. Those were actually guilds at one time, stonemasons and weavers and the millers that would, make flour or whatever, the goldsmiths. And so in modern day times, those unions really came out of those guilds.
Yes, and the Maltese cross, a form of that cross, is used for a lot of ambulance services, EMS services, hospitals, because it was essentially an order created to provide hospitals 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So people are keeping that legacy alive in their logos.
Very cool.
So we'll jump back to that slide. So that was in 1540. Well, in Scotland, they had remained somewhat still Catholic, although the Protestant movement was building. And the Scottish Parliament in 1555 outlawed secret stonemason meetings because they didn't want them again to be making plans that people didn't know about. Well, it didn't take long for big projects to start falling apart, and Mary Queen of Scots realized that she wasn't going to be able to build a beautiful kingdom without the help of the stonemasons, so she signed a edict that they could meet in secret again.
So the stonemasons, they built the cathedrals and mansions and palaces, and they had some formulas that they kind of kept to themselves, how to do things, right?
Yes, and that was where the secrecy began, was in keeping the skills down, or private, so that other people couldn't start building the buildings. You couldn't even work on a building unless you knew the secret handshake, the secret word or whatever, so that they knew that you were a qualified stonemason. And it was practical. They didn't want the building to fall down.
In today's age, we call that intellectual property.
Yep.
Right? They're protecting their intellectual property.
So, right about the same time, the gentleman who was the Grand Master of the Knights of Malta and the Temple, or St. John and the Temple, was named James Sandilands, and although he was Catholic, he was getting pressure from the Protestants to dissolve the order in Scotland, as it had been dissolved elsewhere. And so he made a deal with Mary, Queen of Scots, that he would dissolve the Knights of Malta and the Temple. He would turn over all possessions to her and pay her a certain amount of money. She, in turn, granted back to him 3 of the most prominent Templar properties in Scotland, the ones you always read about, for him to own, and he became Lord Torphican. It looks like Torpichin, It's actually Lord Torphican. And so in just a space of 7 years, actually 6 years, Mary Queen of Scots saved secret stonemason meetings, which allowed for Freemasonry to eventually move into those Masonic halls and build Freemasons. Now, that organization might have taken on some other form had it not been for the secret stonemasons, but that's not how it happened. And so you could say that she paved the way for Freemasonry by doing that, and she accepted the final possessions of the Knights of Malta and the Temple within Scotland. So she saw the end of the Templar Malta era and the beginning of the Freemason era under her reign.
Wow.
So that man was James Sandilands, and his heir was also named James Sandilands, and he became a Knight Baronet of Nova Scotia. And 3 other men involved in this deal became Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia. So there's your link from the Malta and the Temple organization to the Knights Baronet.
Okay, for those that are maybe their first time visiting with us, the Knight Baronets were who?
Well, William Alexander, who was the proprietor of Nova Scotia, he was given it in 1621. By 1625, he realized he didn't have enough money and enough people. So he and King James devised this new knighthood called the Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia. Sometimes it's called the Knights of Nova Scotia, sometimes it's called the Baronets, but the full title was Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia. And it was a different kind of knighthood because instead of going out and earning it in the field of battle or other service to the king, you just got your wallet out and you paid a certain amount of money and you promised 6 settlers that would go to Nova Scotia. And the idea originally was 100, then it got moved to 120, then it got moved to 150, but we've found about 122, I think, because the records get a little murky. Most of them aren't, but some of them are. So they brought in quite a bit of money, and the king would get some of it, and William Alexander would get some of it, and he would get his men that he needed to go over to Nova Scotia. And if you watched last month's episode, Doc found a map that actually had the locations of the land that the Knights Baronet got. And then we found another map that also showed it, very similar, and we found a list of all the Knights Baronet with where they lived. That's why he mentioned Anticosti. And what's interesting about Anticosti, and this is the last line in this slide, is that right at the bottom, Walter Sandilands eventually inherited the Lord Torpichin title. And, of course, he was related to the last Grand Master of the Knights of Malta and the Temple in Scotland. And he became a Knights Baronet. Well, he inherited his grandfather's title. And he had land in Anticosti, which is right off the coast of the Gasp Peninsula, that whole area that was originally Nova Scotia. But not only that, he married Sir William Alexander's granddaughter.
Keep it in the family.
And and her father, who was William Jr., was the world's first Freemason. So you have the Knights Templar, the Knights Malta, the Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia, and the Freemasons, all embodied in this one person, and also in the Alexander family. And we're going to show you another family here in a minute. So it's just an amazing history. And you mentioned the primary documents.
Yes, primary sources, yeah.
If you look at this next slide here, both of these were written by the Pope in 1312. And the one on the left is called Vox in Excelso. I believe that's how the Latin is.
Vox means voice or sound.
And that is the one where the Templars were actually dissolved, and that's where the words Perpetual Prohibition appear in that document right there.
Forever and ever, huh?
And right next to it, at the right, is another papal bull issued the same year, because now they realize, well, what do we do with all their properties? We've dissolved the order, but they had 9,000 properties across Europe. They had 640 in Scotland that they know of. So this is a papal bull written the same year called Ad Providam, I believe is how you'd say that. This is where it said that the Knights Templar possessions and properties went to the Knights of Malta. So there's your transference of families moved over, because they didn't want to, the Templars that didn't want to get executed joined the Knights of Malta.
I'm good with Malta.
Possessions went over there, and the ideals of the knighthood. And after that happened, the Knights of Malta that had been mostly associated with hospitals and health, that kind of thing, they became a military order. Whew. And they specifically created a navy, and they worked with the French Navy. They fought pirates, the Barbary pirates. We also know for a fact that they sailed to Nova Scotia. They also sailed to the Caribbean. So they became known as the sailing monks from this. So there's two primary sources.
So if I got this right, Pope gets ticked off at the Knights Templar, says they're disbanded, I'm taking everything they own, and then I'm going to give it to my friends, the Knights of St. John or Knights of Malta.
Yes.
Just like that.
And it wasn't so much that he got ticked off at him, it was King Philip of France.
Oh.
And he owed them a lot of money. And he figured it was easier to dissolve them and take their money than to pay them the money that he owed them. And the Pope did not want to do it, because he wrote, there's a thing called the Chinan Parchment, and it was only recently discovered at the Vatican, but he wrote that he was giving full pardon to all of them, including Jacques de Molay. All they had to do was just say, I guess admit to the trumped up charges or whatever.
Oh, they were terrible charges.
But he did not want to dissolve it personally, but he was under pressure from King Philip, who a lot of people think was his puppeteer.
Real tug of war there.
And but he just couldn't fight the trend. And so eventually he had to issue the document that dissolved them.
So I want to just go back real quick. You said that the Knights of Malta traveled into Nova Scotia?
Yes, we're going to do a future show on this, but we have, as I said, we have 3 stones which we believe have carved Maltese cross on it, and I think we haven't done a count on it because we're not on that show yet, but I believe we have about 8 or 10 actual men who were known Knights of Malta who were in Nova Scotia in its earliest history.
Okay, everybody's watching us right now, and they're saying, well, are they close to Oak Island?
Well, yeah.
Okay.
Within not walking
You're welcome.
distance,
I asked the question.
A half a day sail, and maybe closer than that. We don't know. But again, that's a show for another day, and we really have a lot of development to do on that. All of these shows take a ton of time. Like the last month's show, we had it in the works for 3 months. But anyway, and that's not a complaint, because we love doing it. We're get down.
Keeps me out of trouble.
We get down in these rabbit holes, and there's spider webs everywhere.
Jim, one more question, because I know people are watching right now, and they're saying, yeah, but everybody keeps saying Knights Templars this and the Portuguese Templars that. Could they be mistaking them for the Knights of Malta, perhaps?
They could be.
Because they're seeing these crosses and things.
Yes. And also, there's historic records of the Knights of Malta there, which is different. There aren't historic records of the Templars in Nova Scotia.
All right.
It's a theory that people work on, but there's no evidence of it. But there's specific evidence of the Knights of Malta being there, and physical evidence, we believe, in the form of 3 different crosses. So that's just a little tease for that show. That's going to be a couple shows from now. Next month we got a dandy. Okay.
No, don't give it away.
We're not give that away, but it's going to be a dandy. We're having a special guest. Anyway, so again, we're going back to primary source documents. So if you look at this next slide, of course, that's Mary Queen of Scots on the left there. This is the document that she wrote and signed that allowed stonemasons to meet in secret again. And this was only found in, I believe it was 2019. They knew it existed and all that, but the actual document had been shuffled in with other papers in this royal residence called Holyrood Palace. And it's down at one end of the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, and Edinburgh Castle's up at the other end. And they were shuffling through the papers, and somebody saw, wow, what is this thing? And they started deciphering it, and here it was, the actual edict that allowed stonemasons to go back to meeting in secret. So that document changed history right there, because, again, the Freemasons would not have formed in stonemason lodges without it. They might have formed in some other form somewhere else, but specifically they could do it because she allowed the stonemasons to have.
So let me ask you a question. Jim, you've been writing books now for quite a long time about this whole discussion that we're having. This would have been new information to you?
Yes, well, I found it out last year, but
I mean, you didn't know about it 10 books ago, 8 books ago.
No.
So I guess where I'm going with this is you and I, we're constantly evolving the theory, our history, putting pieces in together. And this is another piece of the whole story, isn't it?
Well, even the Chinan parchment that I mentioned, that was only found in 2021.
That just
People, there was a smaller version of it that they had, and there were rumors about the larger Chinan parchment, and a lady working at the Vatican Archives found it. And it explained so much, people were just stunned. So it is kind of neat that nowadays, using more modern techniques and research methods and all that, that you can actually find out more about history than what they just knew 100 years ago or 200 years ago, because they had limited resources. We can get resources all over. I've worked with the British Museum, with the Scottish National Museum, whatever, and you email them and you say, I'm working on this theory and I'm wondering about this. And I'll tell you, the people who work, the staff, let's call it, are so cooperative. Wow. I mean, you hear right away. You get stuff that you couldn't even imagine. We don't have too much, and it's this much stuff. You're like, oh my gosh. So sometimes I have to say that the top dogs, which we might call the mainstreamers, are a little bit reluctant to accept new theories and whatever. And I've butted heads with a few of them. But that's not true with the staff. The staff usually wants to know. That's why they're there, because they love the work and they want to know. And if they can help you know, they're going to help you. Nice. So this is an interesting slide. This is William Alexander's 1624 map. Now, we've used this in a number of shows. There's a much older looking one. This is a cleaned up version of the same exact map. And we've pointed this out in past shows too, but you'll see down in the lower left the arrow pointing to a title, and that's Earl of Arundel. And he was on this map in 1624. Well, if you go over to the bottom right, it was Sir Thomas Howard, Earl of Arundel. He descended from Sir Alan Howard, Earl of Norfolk, who was a Knights Templar. But on his grandmother's maternal side, he descended from Richard FitzAlan, Earl of Arundel and Knight of Malta.
Get out.
Yeah. So he came from both
branches.
Both orders.
Wow.
Yes. And he happened to be the Grand Master of Masons when William Alexander's sons and his business partner became the first Freemasons. So now he ties in the Freemasons with those two organizations. Well, he and Alexander lived only a mile from each other in London. Sir Francis Bacon died at Howard's house. Howard had this just amazing collection of old inscribed stones, much like the 90-foot stone, but paintings, all kinds of statues. And when he passed away, 2 generations later, they got moved to the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, created by Elias Ashmole, one of the top early Freemasons, and they're still there today. We featured that in an earlier show.
Okay, in show number 4 of Oak Island Plus, we did the 90-foot stone. You used the Mary Queen of Scots cipher or code,
Yes.
and you told the world who was on that stone.
Yes, Thomas Howard and his son Henry, and another gentleman, William Douglas, who was the treasurer of Scotland, using her cipher. And, you know, I'm not going to insist that that's correct, but I did an awful lot of research. I spent a lot of money. I was the first person in the world to own digital collection of her codes, and they had to go look for them, sort them out of 400 letters of hers. There were 104 sheets in the end, and I paid them to scan them in. Whether they've shared them with other people by now, I don't know, but at one point in history,
You're the first guy.
I own the world's biggest collection, digital collection of her codes. That's what I used for that stone. But jumping back to the map here real quick, so that kind of explained, Thomas Howard, William Alexander, and for a while, Sir Francis Bacon lived in this part of London that was within walking distance of this place called Charing Cross, which is still there today.
Your neighbors.
Yeah. And that was what they call the notional center of
Right.
London. Everything's measured from there. It's not the real center or geographic center, but it's the notional center. Well, what's coincidental is that up above Oak Island at New Ross, where there's a foundation there, New Ross used to be called Charing Cross. And that foundation, according to Alexander legend and Mi'kmaq oral tradition, was built for William Alexander. So it seems obvious that he wanted that point to be the notional center of Nova Scotia. Not the geographic center, but the notional center. And it's not the highest hill. Some people say that that's the highest point, but there's a couple points higher than that.
Right.
But still, it's prominent. And what else it had in its favor is Mahone Bay goes downhill one direction, and Port Royal, where his people settled, goes downhill the other direction. And there were trails right across there. Now there's some roads following those old trails, but you could go from Mahone Bay, pull into Mahone Bay, your guys get off the ship, walk up over the hill, and see who's at Port Royal, if you got to attack them or not. So, and then earlier we mentioned Walter Sandilands. Now that arrow point, that upper arrow points to Anticosti Island. That wasn't part of the original grant, but William Alexander took it anyway, and he settled.
I'll have that too. Thank you very much.
And he was the final, well, he was the heir of the final Grand Master of the Knights of Malta and the Temple. And he married Alexander's granddaughter, who was the daughter of the world's first Freemason. And he was a Knights Baronet and owned land on Anticosti Island. So there's this multi-generational conspiracy of elites once again. And then, of course, William Alexander was part of that whole thing because he was born on Knights Templar land. There's a very good chance that his ancestor was a Knights Templar, or at least a crusading knight, because a Crusader's cross was found near where he's buried on an island. And he created Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia, and his sons and partners became the first Freemasons. So there's three people right there in history, all documented, who connect 4 groups: Templars, Malta, Knights Baronet, and Freemasons. But there's more, and there's more in this book. But you just can't put a whole lot in the show. It's a lot of reading. But so we have one more slide, and this slide kind of tells what the final transfer of the baronets to Freemasonry.
Okay.
So in 25, the Knights Baronet were formed, and there were over 120 men, we know, mostly from very well-known Scottish clans: Keith, Ramsay, MacDonald, Gordon, Stewart, even Sinclair.
Yeah, there were quite a few, yeah.
And and a lot of these people had legends in their families of relationships to either the Knights of Malta or the Knights Templar. And from 1628 to 1632, they had a presence in Nova Scotia as the Knights Baronet, or settlers of the Knights Baronet. A lot of the knights didn't actually ever get there, but the people did. And at one point, it's said that William Alexander had 2,000 people at his settlement at Port Royal. And most people say there was only 70, and most people say it failed, and it didn't fail. The king pulled the rug out from underneath him and traded it back to France. He was going fine. Everything was going fine there. So it did not fail. But so he came back. They had to figure out what to do next, and it was getting very apparent that being a knight was not a safe place to be in a country that was turning Protestant and turning against royalty, mostly led by Oliver Cromwell, who absolutely hated royalty. And a lot of people were losing their heads, and a lot of people being thrown in jail, and etc. So in 1634, the first Freemasons were initiated, and that was William Alexander Jr., his brother Anthony, and his father's Nova Scotia partner, Al Strachan.
Okay. People watching right now say, how do you know that?
Well, because there's the book, The History of the Edinburgh Lodge #1, Mary's Chapel, has the whole history, and it has the actual minutes written for each, the minute they call it, the minute for each person's initiation and their signatures. And Al was involved in this big robbery, and that's listed in that book, but it's also listed in a court record and in the King's Privy Council minutes. So that's verified 3 different ways.
Okay.
And within just a few years of that, Robert Moray, who created the Royal Society, which was quite obviously based on Freemason logic, he became a Freemason in 1641, and then 5 years later, the famous Elias Ashmole was initiated, and he's the one that created the Ashmolean Museum. That was the first public museum. They think that is the very first public museum in modern history, at that Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. And and what was cool about it was that's where Thomas Howard's collection was taken, because Ashmole became a Freemason the same year that Thomas Howard passed away, and he made sure that his collections got to this museum.
So to discriminate between stonemasons and Freemasons, Freemasons are what are called non-operative. They're not out there chipping stone or laying bricks, but they were initiated into the stonemasons as members of a secret society where they could meet in private, right?
Right. And originally they were looking for people that had architectural knowledge or knowledge of antiquities, and the Alexanders met that because Anthony Alexander was the master of public works for Scotland, and he'd studied architecture in Europe for 3 years. So it wasn't just willy-nilly, let's just let these guys in. There was a reason for it. But by the time Robert Moray entered the field, it turned military. And probably one of the reasons was because they were getting put upon by everybody so bad. They thought, we need some strong guys here that know a lot of strong guys. So Alexander Hamilton, not the one from America, but an earlier one, he was initiated in 1640, and Moray was initiated in 1641, and they were both military men. And Al Strachan had been a military man too, so that might be why he was included in the first 3. So it wasn't like they wanted to become a military organization, like the Knights Templar were a military order. They just wanted some kind of protection. And then it built, and it built, and it moved down to England, moved to France, moved to Australia, moved to America, and it was essentially the same organization. And the Grand Lodge of Scotland was established, this is an amazing statistic, the Grand Lodge of Scotland was established in 1736. And over the next 288 years, till this year, 90 out of 110 Grand Masters of this lodge come directly from Knights Baronet families. That's about 82.3%.
What you're saying is their family lineage?
Yes, and some of them were actually Knights of Baronet of Nova Scotia while they were Grand Masters of the Scottish Lodge. And it filtered down into England. A number of the English Grand Masters were from Baronet families. Same way in Australia. Down in France, James Maclean who descended from a Knights Templar, Lachlan MacLean, was the second Grand Master of the French Grand Lodge. And in Nova Scotia, the original lodge in Halifax, the records of it read like a list of Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia. Right. Not only that, but Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, which were all of the original grant, all had Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia as their governors at one point. So that's how they just permeated the whole history of Nova Scotia. It's just an amazing story, and obviously there's a whole lot more in this book than that, but all the middle areas are filled in. I've got some history about Hugh de Payens, about how the Knights of Malta came about, how they had to move to these different locations, the whole events in Scotland were the demise, you might say, of the Templars and the Knights of Malta, and then the rise of Freemasonry, with wedged in there the Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia. It's all based on real history.
So, Jim, who should read this? Who's your audience, do you think? I mean, this is pretty heavy stuff.
Yes, and it purposely does not mention Oak Island in it, simply because I swore off doing any Oak Island books. But it pertains because these are the same people that everybody always talks about. See, Nova Scotia was prime territory. It would be like the first area that you would come to that the climate was decent enough to live in. Newfoundland, there were people up there, but it was a little cold and barren. But Nova Scotia was full of bounty. All they talked about was all the firs and the trees and the plants that you could find.
Good soil,
all that. And it was the gateway to the rest of North America because you had the St. Lawrence Seaway at the top, which would get you down through all the Great Lakes. And at the bottom, you could go down to Cape Cod and then all the way to Virginia and all the way to the Caribbean. So, but that would be where most people would come first. And from the British Isles, it was a 5 to 6 week journey, depending on the wind. Everything always depended on the wind. And sometimes they made it home quicker because of currents. And from France, they usually took off at Rochelle, the port of Rochelle, and it wasn't much longer from there. So that's reasonable. If you're asking a military guy, we need you to travel for 5 or 6 weeks, but then you're going to be there in the land of opportunity and abundance.
Sounds good.
You know, a lot of people went, obviously, and so I would say people that are interested in any of this history, whether you're a Templar fan, a Knights of Malta fan, you want to learn more about that order, if you want to learn more, obviously, about Nova Scotia and about the Knights of Nova Scotia, which were so critical, and this beginning of Freemasonry and how it worked up till the first Grand Lodge was the Grand Lodge of England in 1717, and a lot of people say that's where Freemasonry began, but because 4 lodges joined together to form it.
Right.
So they already had to exist.
And the Grand Lodge is like a umbrella over smaller lodges.
Right. And these smaller lodges already existed, and they also existed in Scotland. So what somebody identified the fact that we've got these more or less random lodges. They're generally set up where there's a lot of building, you know, because they were half stonemason, you know, roughly half stonemason, half Freemason. And so they would set up a lodge in that general area because they wanted to travel all the time. They didn't have vehicles to travel in. And so that's how the lodges developed. Well, then somebody said, well, if we're going to be turning into this Freemason organization that's more about building the world and less about building a building, we have to have some kind of better organization. So England did it in 1717 and Scotland did it in 1736. Cool. In America, there's a lot of Grand Lodges. They're all over.
New York has a Grand Lodge. Almost every state has a Grand Lodge.
Because our states are almost as big as these individual countries. I think Nova Scotia is like 2/3 as big as Scotland. So,
very good. Jim, how do you get a hold of this book?
Well, it's on Amazon, like the rest of my books. It's Perpetual Prohibition, and it's just under James A. McQuiston. And it's a great read, and I'm very proud of it. I don't stray much into theories. I mostly stick with the documents and the known history. And I think that would be something that a lot of historically inclined people would appreciate because they don't want to you can, how many theories does Oak Island have?
I've run
Pirates
out.
and,
Overwhelming, actually.
yeah. So this isn't about that. This is about actual documentation of how these organizations followed one after the other. And I think essentially, to some degree, Freemasonry was like a knighthood, but without the trappings of knighthood, because being a knight was getting awful dangerous under Oliver Cromwell.
Right.
And so they went into secret. They worked on how to make the world better.
Yeah, definitely. And
better.
still do. They still do. All right. Well, I think that kind of brings us to the end of the show.
Yeah.
So I want to do a shout out, of course, to our cameraman, Randy Burt. Thanks, Randy, as always. And to Jackie Phillips, who's been our mentor in the behind the scenes here at the Innovation Studio at Lakeshore Center for the Arts in Westfield. And I'm going to say goodbye, and I'll let you get the last word in, Jim.
Goodbye, and just wait till next month, because we got a heck of a show coming. So thank you very much.
And hit that subscribe button if you can. Thank you.
This is Robert Clotworthy, and you have been listening to Oak Island Plus, a discussion of Oak Island and other mysteries from around the world. Be sure to catch every episode.